Three things you'll see from this passage. Number one, God's people must suffer loss before receiving his promises. God's people must suffer loss before they receive his promises. Number two, God's people know that the promises of him extend beyond this life. We know that his promises extend beyond this life. And then number three, God's people show their faith by reconciling death and his abiding promises. So let's look at those three things. Number one, God's people must suffer loss before receiving the promises. Verses 1 and 2, we see again that Sarah passed away at 27 years old. If you're keeping score, this would make Abraham 137 years old. He must have been an amazing person. I know I'll never make it to 137. I don't know that I'll make it to 77. But at 137, he was still a very, very strong individual. He was still a very strong businessman, and he was still carrying around the work that he always had. Yet he had to bury his wife. God had promised Abraham when he was 75 to come out of this pagan land called Ur and follow him, and he was going to make him a great nation. Then God specifically, remember, came back and said, Abraham, I'm going to make you a nation, and I'm going to give you and your wife a natural son. It doesn't matter that you're 75 and she's 65. I'm going to do it. Well, along the way, we've seen Abraham and Sarah did some things to mess that up and should try to do things on their own, and they couldn't do it. And all they did was mess it up. And then God came back to him again when he was 99, and then she was 89, and says, within the year you're going to have this child. And Sarah laughed because it just seemed unbelievable. Yet when Abraham was 100 and Sarah was 90, God fulfilled his promise. And he did so in such a miraculous way that everyone knew that God did so. But he also not only promised that he would have a son, God also promised that he would inherit this land. And God promised that he was going to make Abraham a great nation. So the people to whom the promise was being made to were dying off. Things that seemed bleak for Abraham before, and they probably seem a little bleak right now. Okay, God promised us, but look at the situation we're in. He promised them, and they were dying. I think we can relate to Abraham right here. Because we often will have griefs and struggles, and we'll look at them and wonder about God's promises. That's where Abraham was. God, I know you promised to take care of my needs, but this light bill is due yesterday. God, I know you promised to take care of my needs. I've got $10 in the checking account, and I've got a $200 car bill. God, I know you promised to always be with me. But I don't know how to go on with the loss of this bill. We've all felt where Abraham was, at least in this horrible situation. And in this conflict. Oftentimes, God uses loss. And not oftentimes, always God uses loss for his glory. And for our good. And this is the situation Abraham was in. He needed to realize that he had to suffer loss to receive the promise of God. But what verses 3 through 18 teach us is that God's people need to know that his promises extend beyond this lifetime. This is where the Hadlin situation comes through. And more than once, the people of Canaan offered Abraham to have a burial site he did not have to pay for. Yet Abraham insisted on paying for it, not because of pride. After studying this passage out, I'm convinced Abraham purchased it because he knew that God had promised him this land and God had given him the means. And Abraham did not want there ever to be any question that anything was given to him except what God gave to him. Now, it would have been perfectly fine for Abraham to accept the gift, except that maybe to those down the road would have looked like there were strings attached to the gift. Abraham made it very, very clear. He bought this cave to bury his wife. What he was doing is he was securing by faith the promised land. God had provided him with all this silver. And Abraham was wealthy beyond imagination. God had provided him with all sorts of means. If we were to see, if Abraham would have been today, Donald Trump would have had nothing on him. Well, he's a bad example because he's always almost bankrupt. Bill Gates would have had nothing on him. Would have nothing on Abraham. Abraham was very wealthy beyond means, and yet he was also very respected. They said, look, this piece of property is not that big a deal. Take it. He says, no, I'm going to buy it. Because they lived by faith, Abraham was securing the place for the promised land. His concern was for his wife while he was still trusting in God's promises. God promised to give you this land, and he's going to fulfill it, regardless of my wife being gone. And he went through these deep negotiations, I believe, again, for future generations to see that God was the one that had done this. By the way, something interesting here. In the study of Genesis, we'll see. This is the only part of the promised land that Abraham actually received. The only part of the promised land he received was a grave. A cave. It's all he'd ever seen in this lifetime. Yet, what his children and his children's children received was abundant. And again, the Old Testament Israel is not the church, and the church is not Israel. But we also know from our study of the New Testament that all believers are blessed in Abraham.